There are 147.3 million ounces of gold sitting in American vaults. That's the official number. 8,000 tons of the purest metal ever mined, locked behind walls thicker than a prison, guarded by systems designed to stop armies. It's worth over $600 billion at today's prices. It's supposed to be the foundation of American financial credibility, the ultimate insurance policy against currency collapse, the proof that when paper money fails, America still has something real. But here's the problem. No independent auditor has verified that gold exists in over 70 years.
No journalist has been allowed inside to count it. No camera has filmed the entire inventory. The last time anyone outside the government got a real look was 1974, and even that was a staged tour of a single vault room that lasted 2 hours. The United States government asks you to trust that the gold is there. Trust the same institutions that told you weapons of mass destruction were in Iraq. Trust the same system that printed trillions of dollars out of thin air and called it economic stimulus. Trust the same officials who've lied about inflation, about debt, about every financial crisis for the past century. And if you ask questions, if you demand proof, if you want an audit, you're dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. But empires built on trust and secrecy don't last, and the longer they refuse to show the gold, the more obvious it becomes. They're hiding something. This is the story of America's gold, how it was accumulated, why it matters, and the terrifying possibility that it's not there anymore. The story begins in 1933, in the depths of the Great Depression. The American economy was collapsing. Banks were failing by the thousands. People were starving. And President Franklin Roosevelt decided that the problem was gold itself. Specifically, that American citizens owned it. On April 5th, 1933, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102.
It was one of the most authoritarian economic edicts in American history, and most people today have never heard of it. The order made it illegal for American citizens to own gold. Not gold jewelry, that was exempt, but gold coins, gold bullion, gold certificates, anything that could be used as money. Americans were required, under penalty of 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine, to turn in their gold to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper dollars at a rate of $20.67 per ounce. This wasn't a request. It was confiscation. Millions of Americans complied, either out of fear or patriotism or both. They handed over their savings, their family heirlooms, their insurance against disaster. The gold flowed into government vaults by the trainload. And then, once the government had confiscated the gold, Roosevelt revalued it. In 1934, he raised the official price of gold from $20.67 to $35 per ounce, a 69% increase overnight. Think about what that means. The government forced citizens to sell their gold at $20.67, then immediately declared that same gold was worth $35. It was legalized theft on a scale rarely seen in history. The government profited by billions, while ordinary Americans who'd trusted the system were robbed. But the confiscation served another purpose. It concentrated gold in government hands. By 1937, the newly built Fort Knox bullion depository was filled with thousands of tons of seized gold. And as World War II approached, even more gold flowed in from Europe. Nations desperate to protect their reserves from Nazi invasion shipped their gold to America for safekeeping. By 1941, the United States held over 20,000 tons of gold. It controlled roughly 70% of the world's official monetary gold reserves. No nation in history had ever concentrated that much wealth in one place. And that gold became the foundation of the post-war financial order. In 1944, representatives from 44 nations gathered at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the global monetary system that would govern the world for the next 3 decades. The result was simple and brutal. The US dollar would be the world's reserve currency, convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. Why did the world agree to this? Because America had the gold. The deal was explicit. Hold dollars, and you can redeem them for gold anytime you want. The dollar was as good as gold because it was backed by gold. For 2 decades, the system worked. The dollar was stable, international trade flourished, and America enjoyed an extraordinary privilege. It could print dollars to fund its government and military, knowing the world would accept them because they were backed by Fort Knox. But there was a problem. America was spending far more than it was earning. The Vietnam War cost billions. The arms race with the Soviet Union cost billions more. Social programs expanded. Trade deficits grew. And all of that spending meant dollars were flooding out of the country and into foreign hands. Under the Bretton Woods system, those foreign dollars were supposed to be redeemable for gold. And by the 1960s, foreign governments, led by France under Charles de Gaulle, started demanding their gold back. De Gaulle understood what was happening. He saw that America had printed far more dollars than it had gold to back them. He called it America's exorbitant privilege, the ability to pay for goods and wars with paper that other nations were forced to accept. So France began systematically converting its dollar reserves into gold. De Gaulle even sent French naval ships to New York Harbor to collect gold bars and transport them back to Paris. Other nations watched and started doing the same. The gold began flowing out of Fort Knox. By 1971, U.S. gold reserves had fallen from over 20,000 tons to roughly 8,000 tons. And the outflow wasn't stopping. American officials realized they faced a catastrophic choice: honor the Bretton Woods Agreement and watch the gold reserves drain to zero, or break the promise and end convertibility. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on television and announced that the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of dollars into gold. He called it a necessary measure to protect the dollar from speculators. That temporary suspension has now lasted over 50 years. Nixon's decision, known as the Nixon shock, ended the gold standard and put the world on a pure fiat currency system. The dollar was no longer backed by anything real. It was just paper, backed by trust in the U.S. government. And from that moment on, the question became, why does the United States still claim to hold 8,000 tons of gold if the dollar isn't backed by it anymore? The official answer is that gold serves as a, quote, reserve asset, a form of insurance against financial crisis, a symbol of stability. The Federal Reserve holds a gold certificate representing the nation's gold reserves, valued at the archaic price of $42.22 per ounce, a number that hasn't been updated since the 1970s. But if the gold is just sitting there, unused and irrelevant to the modern financial system, why not audit it? Why not prove to the world that it still exists? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. There hasn't been a full, independent, public audit of America's gold in over 70 years. The last comprehensive audit, if you can even call it that, took place in 1953 under President Eisenhower. Rumors were circulating that gold had been secretly used to pay wartime debts. So the government authorized a limited inspection. Auditors were allowed into Fort Knox and shown some of the gold. They didn't count every bar. They didn't test every sample. They checked roughly 5 to 7% of the inventory and declared it in order. That was it. That was the last time independent auditors examined the gold. In 1974, mounting public skepticism forced the government to respond. A Washington attorney had published a book claiming $20 billion worth of gold was missing from Fort Knox. The story gained traction, and Congress demanded answers. So on September 23, 1974, the Treasury Department staged a media event. They invited a group of congressmen and journalists to Fort Knox for a carefully controlled tour. Visitors were shown one vault room filled with stacks of gold bars. They were allowed to hold the bars and take photos. The event is often cited as proof that the gold exists. But it wasn't an audit. It was a photo op. The tour lasted only a few hours. No bars were weighed, tested, or checked against serial number records. The visitors saw a tiny fraction of the total inventory and were escorted out. One radio reporter summed it up perfectly. "All I can say is that I saw gold in there." That's not an audit. That's theater. Between 1975 and 1981, the Treasury and the General Accounting Office conducted a series of audits on portions of the gold. They opened vaults, counted bars, and tested random samples for purity.
By 1981, they reported that roughly 80% of the total gold weight had been verified, and about 21% of the individual bars had been checked by serial number. But even that wasn't a complete audit. 20% of the gold was never verified, and 79% of the bars were never individually examined. And since 1981, nothing. No public audit, no independent verification. The U.S. Mint and Treasury claim the gold is inventoried and audited regularly, but they refuse to release any details to the public. In 2017, Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin visited Fort Knox, the first sitting Treasury Secretary to do so since 1948. After the visit, he declared, "Glad the gold is there." That's it. That's the reassurance the American people are supposed to accept. So why won't they just do a full audit? If the gold is really there, what's the problem? Open the vaults, bring in independent auditors, film the entire process, and put the conspiracy theories to rest. The refusal to do this has spawned decades of speculation about what's really in those vaults. And some of the theories are more plausible than others. One theory is that the gold has been secretly leased or loaned out. Central banks and governments routinely lease gold to bullion banks, who then sell it on the market and use the proceeds for other investments. The gold still appears on the balance sheet as an asset, but physically, it's gone, sold to jewelers, investors, or manufacturers. If the U.S. has been secretly leasing Fort Knox gold, it would explain why they can't show it. Because it's not there. It's been sold and scattered across the world, while the government maintains the fiction that it's still sitting in Kentucky. Another theory is that the gold belongs to other countries, not the United States. During World War II and the Cold War, European nations stored their gold in American vaults for safekeeping. Officially, most of that foreign gold has been repatriated. But what if it hasn't? What if a significant portion of what's in Fort Knox is actually owned by Germany, France, or other allies, and the U.S. is simply holding it as a custodian? That would mean America's actual gold reserves are far smaller than claimed. A more disturbing theory is that some of the gold bars are counterfeit, gold-plated tungsten bars designed to pass a weight test, but worth almost nothing. Tungsten has nearly the same density as gold, making it nearly impossible to detect a fake bar without drilling into it or conducting advanced testing. This theory gained traction in 2009, when reports surfaced that China had received a shipment of gold bars that turned out to be tungsten fakes. The story was never confirmed, but it raised a terrifying question. If counterfeit bars exist in the market, could they also exist in Fort Knox? Congressman Ron Paul publicly questioned whether Fort Knox gold had been tested for authenticity, or if some bars might be gold-plated tungsten. He never got a satisfactory answer. And then there's the simplest theory of all. The gold has been quietly sold off over the decades to manage crises, manipulate gold prices, or cover debts. Governments have done this before. Britain sold much of its gold reserves in the late 1990s at rock-bottom prices. Other nations have done the same. Why would the U.S. be any different?
If the gold is gone, it would explain everything. The refusal to audit, the secrecy, the vague reassurances. Because admitting that the gold is missing would trigger a financial catastrophe. The recent reports of banks flying thousands of gold bars from London to New York have reignited these. Why are JP Morgan and HSBC physically moving billions of dollars worth of gold across the Atlantic? The official explanation is arbitrage. Gold is slightly more expensive in New York than in London, so banks are shipping physical gold to profit from the price difference and cover their short positions in the futures market. That explanation makes sense on the surface, but it also raises questions. If Fort Knox is full of gold, why do banks need to import it from London? Why not just use the domestic supply? Some believe this is evidence that U.S. gold reserves are depleted or inaccessible, forcing banks to scramble for physical metal from overseas. Others think it's just routine market mechanics with no deeper meaning. But the fact that we're even debating this 70 years after the last real audit is absurd. Even Elon Musk has weighed in, suggesting that Fort Knox should be audited and the results live-streamed to the public. He's right. In an age where we can watch rockets land themselves and explore Mars in real time, why can't we see a simple inventory of gold bars? The standard objections are security and cost. Officials claim that a full audit would be expensive, logistically complex, and could compromise security by revealing the exact layout and inventory of the vaults. But those excuses don't hold up. A full audit could be conducted by independent firms with appropriate security clearances. The results could be published in detail without compromising vault security. And the cost, whatever it is, would be trivial compared to the value of the gold and the importance of public confidence. The real reason they won't audit is simpler. They can't afford to. Because if the audit revealed that the gold is missing, or that significant portions have been leased out, or that some bars are fake, the consequences would be catastrophic. The dollar's credibility rests, in part, on the perception that America still has a massive reserve of real wealth. If that perception is shattered, trust in the dollar collapses. Foreign governments would dump treasury bonds. Inflation would spiral. The entire global financial system, built on dollar dominance, would be thrown into chaos. So instead, the government asks you to trust. Trust that the gold is there. Trust that the audits are happening even though you can't see them. Trust that the institutions that have lied about everything else are telling the truth about this. But trust is not a substitute for proof, and secrecy is not a substitute for transparency. The gold is either there or it isn't. And after 70 years of evasion, the refusal to prove it tells you everything you need to know. History is full of empires that claim to have vast reserves of wealth, only for those reserves to vanish when the crisis came. Spain looted the New World for gold and still went bankrupt. France issued paper currency backed by confiscated land and ended up in hyperinflation. Every empire that played games with money eventually paid the price. America is no different. The gold may be in Fort Knox, untouched and safe, or it may be scattered across the world, leased to banks, sold to cover debts, or never there in the first place. But until the vaults are opened, until every bar is counted and tested, until independent auditors verify the inventory and publish the results, we don't know. And the fact that we don't know is a scandal in itself. The biggest cover-up in history isn't always the one with the most dramatic revelation. Sometimes it's the one where the truth is hidden in plain sight, behind walls of secrecy, guarded by institutions that refuse to answer the simplest question. Show us the gold. History doesn't repeat, but if you ignore it, it will crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. The truth is in the vaults, if they'll ever let us see it.